So in this last video, we are going to display the score on the screen and also set up a way for our game to be over. So I'm going to scroll down, and I'm actually going to put this right below my bullet setup and above my functions. So the first thing I need to do is initialize the ability to use fonts. So I'm going to type pygame.font.init or initialize. Above this whole section, I'm going to write bring in fonts and set up score display. Underneath this line, and this isn't something you'd necessarily memorize unless you use Pygame a lot, it's not connected to stuff we've done, it's just a specific method. We're going to do font equals pygame.font.capitalize font, and then this is the specific setup for CodeHS for a font to be used. It's pygame.font.get_default _font parentheses, so that's the long name of the font, and then we pick the font size as the second parameter, so I'm going to use font size 32. So basically this just sets up the fact that we can use a font. Below this, we are going to set up a function to show the score. So I'm going to put this above my other functions just so it's kind of in that same location. So I'm going to define a function called showScore, no parameters here. And I'm going to set up a score variable. Now we already have a score variable. We're going to have to do some adjustments with this in a second. So this score variable is going to take the actual score and create the display. So I'm actually going to set up a new variable up here underneath my pygame.font.initialize. Here I'm going to set up a variable called score value, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. From there, I'm going to move that back up, and now I can come down. So I have a score value equal to 0. This you can think of as the display score. So maybe I will put that in here, or actually I'm going to put score first, so that's going to be easier to see. So I'm going to put score underscore display. So basically here, this is the score's value, right, an integer, and this is going to be what's displayed. So the next thing I need to type with this, another thing that's not necessarily something you would memorize, is font.render. And for this, we're going to display the score. So this is a string, I'm going to leave a space there. Plus, I'm going to take my score value and convert that to a string. So this is kind of like a print statement. Close that off. And the next thing I need actually is false, which is opposite of what you would do in PyCharm. We have to set a value of whether or not this is true or false. This is something I'm not sure about because for some reason false works in this CodeHS. So just put it at false always if you want it to display. And I am going to make my text red. You can make it whatever color you want. So that's an RGB code. So for this font render, basically we're setting up here this line to be printed. That's what's going to print. We're setting a variable to false, and then we're picking a color. So I check my parentheses, looks good. And the next thing I need to do, now that I have this score display set up, I'm going to use this screen.lit function. And I'm going to display the score display, just like we displayed player image or the enemy image or any of those things. And here, I'm going to put that at 10, 10. So that's just the location. It's not going to move around like some other things. So I've actually picked numerical values here. I'm just going to enter this down. So this should show our score. So then I'm going to move down and call my function. We also, if you remember, we had this score variable that was just showing the score. So we're going to have to kind of change this because now I have two different variables, the score value and the score display, to keep those separated. So I'm going to delete this code right here, and then I'm going to head down into my while loop. So the first place that I'm going to go is down here, and I'm going to call my function. So I'm going to call that right above the player X, player Y. I really could put it anywhere in this area. And actually, yeah, that's a good spot. So my function is called show underscore score. There are no parameters, so that should be good. As I scrolled down, I also saw here in the collision setting, I have score increasing. Really, I want to do score value. Now I could get rid of this print score, but I'm going to keep that just to kind of make sure things are running. So I'm going to do value, score value there. Now I'm going to test my program just to see how it's working. So here I see my score. If I click on the screen and I shoot at one of these guys, okay, so I see that they're moving up, and as I hit them, both the score at the top of the screen, score equals 3, and the score at the bottom of the screen are both basically doing the same thing. So they're both increasing. Now I wanted to address this issue of the fact that there's only 4 of these guys here. I actually realized that that's not just because they're overlapping. There's something we need to change in the code. So I'm going to stop this program. Basically, if you look up or you go up to the movement of all of the enemies section, so this section here, here I have elif enemy x sub of I is greater than 380, my enemy change is going to switch in the opposite direction. So basically what's happening here is if my enemy randomly gets placed at, let's say, 410, because if I look up at my code, and you can leave it where it is, I'm just going to point out the spot, I'm picking a random spot between 0 and 450. So if my enemy is at 410, here, basically it's going to check, see it's at 410, and it's going to move it back 0.5. And it's going to move it down 40. And then when it's at 409.5, it's going to do the same thing. So it's going to stay greater than 380 so long that over here it's just going to keep moving down 40, 40, 40, 40, and go off the screen. Now, that kind of doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal because we just get a different amount of enemies. But the problem lies if I want to stop the game when one of the enemies gets down to the bottom of the screen. Then if I have a couple enemies, 1 or 2, that get shot down to the bottom of the screen, basically I can't even play the game. So we need to set this at that outermost boundary of 450. Okay, there's a couple other ways you can handle it. Our enemy might go slightly off the screen, especially since with this particular window in this computer, 450 is not the perfect number. So I'm not going to go around and shift everything around. I probably should maybe set it at like 420 and then use that here. 420 is my screen size, but for now, just change this enemy x of I is greater than 450, and we should see all of the enemies working. So we're going to try that now. Let me just run my code. Look here, you see my enemies slightly going off the screen if I scroll over. I also have the issue of, my background could be a little bit bigger, but the idea here is I do have all 6 of the enemies, so that should kind of solve that problem. So the next thing we're going to work out at our program, we're going to scroll back up and we're going to start to set game over. So the first thing I'm going to do is I have to set up, I want to display game over in the text. So I'm going to go down to that section with my fonts, which is right below the bullets. I'm going to put in a comment that this is the font for the score. And below this, I'm going to put the font for game over. So this code is going to be really similar. I just need to cut and paste this line. Okay. So I have font equals pygame.font, and this time we are going to do basically the same thing. We need to change the name of this. So this is my score font, and I can actually change that. So we can go to score font here. I just have to make sure down here where I talked about the font, I put score.font or score_font. Difficult to say. So those two will connect to each other. And this one I'm going to type over font for game over. And this time, because I kind of want to just big in the middle, I'm going to make it font size 64. So same code, just font size 64. So down here, I'm going to create a function. And I'm just going to copy my show score function. We're going to call this function game over. I don't know how that was working without a colon, but we'll put that in. And I'm actually going to call it game over text here because this is displaying a text for game over. So here, instead of score display, I'm going to name this variable over display. Okay, so this is like the game over display. And we're going to have the same score font dot render, except here I don't want the score font dot render. I want the over font dot render because that's going to go with this variable. So I'm going to just display game over, maybe with an exclamation point. I don't need any sort of string printed with it. It's just a game over. I'm going to keep this in the red color. I keep this as false. And then we are going to screen blit the over display. This is the game over display. And I'm going to put it, I found that 175 was good. I want it in the center of the screen, but I picked 50 because that kind of sets it up so game over shows you the game starts not towards the center, but once the over comes out, it's in the center. And this is a bit of a ways like kind of in the middle of the screen. So how are we going to call this function? We are going to scroll down and really what is determining when the game is over? It has to do with the movement of the enemies. So we're going to come down to the movement of the enemy section. So we're going to check each of our enemies because even one of my enemies being too low, right, is going to cause a problem. So I press enter here and I'm going to check this very first thing before I start moving them anywhere or anything like that. So for J, in range, because we're going to actually check again. We're going to check each of the enemies. So we're going to go through each of the enemies and then we're going to check them here. Step back a second on that. For each of the enemies, like I said, we need to check their position. So I am going to do for enemy, and we want to check their Y position. So we're checking each of them. So we do this I. This should be if enemy Y I is greater than 390. So I kind of played around with it. This seemed to work pretty well. If you put it too high, the game ends too soon. If you put it too low, it's just kind of like overlapping the spaceship for a while. So here, greater than 390, then we are going to take all of my enemies. So I already have an I going on. I'm going to use for J in range num of enemies. And we're going to send them to the bottom of the screen. So the fastest way, or just really any way to do it, I'm just going to do enemy Y, and this is going to be a J here because that's our variable in this for loop. We are going to set them equal to 600. So they're still there, but they are below the screen. So they're somewhere down here and we can't see any of them. And then we're also going to display game over. So this doesn't need to be in the for loop. I'm just displaying it once, but I'm going to call the game over text function. And then I'm going to break out of my for loop. So in here, even though this is part of this, I'm going to put enemies too low, game over. So we have this, and that's just kind of happening before I start moving my enemies. One more change before we run the program. I ran it, and actually I thought it was a problem with this being at a certain value, but it was the other problem where I had the spaceships kind of flying off the side when they got past that 400 or that 386 mark. So we're actually going to make them just get down to 250. And what's nice about this is that basically they're going to come up and just kind of brush the top of the rocket and then stop then when it's game over. So I'm going to pause the video and run it. Let it run a little bit so that they're pretty close. I'm just going to push the space bar. Hopefully I'll hit one of them, but I'm going to let this closest one go all the way down to the bottom because my video can only be 20 seconds longer because I'm using the free version. So here, if you saw, there was a spaceship that went off the side, and basically when he came back, he was coming towards the rocket. One idea would be to make it, when it hits the rocket, we could use some code